Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show. Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers, because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and working on a product to help people overcome these problems, because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest is Yugeesh Lankadeva. He's an associate professor. He's the theme head of systems neuroscience at the Florey University of Melbourne in Australia. I'm going to talk about the pathophysiology of multi-organ dysfunction that comes from sepsis. Terrible, terrible condition that we'll get into. So Yugeesh, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me here, Richard.
If you would, let's start out. Tell me a bit about your background and how you got into this area of medicine.
Yeah, so I was originally from Sri Lanka, born and raised, and I came to Australia to do my university studies, finished my Bachelor of Biomedicine with honors at Sydney University, and then went to Monash University to undertake my PhD in cardiovascular medicine and physiology. That's when I kind of fell in love with cardiovascular system and how that affects other vital organs such as the brain and the kidneys that kind of fluctuates into a vicious cycle in most diseases. And following my PhD at Monash, then I kind of moved to the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, which is also called Florey now, to really undertake this research in critical illnesses such as sepsis and also heart surgery requiring the heart-lung machine or cardiopulmonary bypass, which are two of the most common causes of brain and kidney injury in intensive care units. And it's a field that's fascinated me because, you're dealing with critically ill patients treated in intensive care units, and the treatment options are really limited for those vulnerable populations. So new effective diagnostics and treatments are urgently needed. That's what really drives my research.
So in talking about sepsis, can we start with that? Like, where does that occur? Only a hospital setting? And what does it do to some of the body and organs?
Yeah, so sepsis, actually 70% of the cases of sepsis is community-based and 30% is hospital-acquired. Sepsis is usually characterized by an underlying infection, be bacterial, viral, fungal, or polymicrobial in nature. Usually starts from a localized source, but when our innate immune system can't battle it within a localized source, it kind of spreads around the body, kind of causing a systemic infection, which then leads to life-threatening falls in blood pressure that then drives multi-organ dysfunction and death. And currently, concerningly, it actually affects about 50 million people around the world every year, and it kills about 11 million people every year. And due to our increasing incidence of antibiotic resistance and also due to our aging population, the annual incidence of cases of sepsis continues to rise.
So where does sepsis come from? How do people get it?
Yeah, so it could be like a urinary tract infection, which is quite common in females. Could be due to a lung infection, like pneumonia, be like a fungal infection in the leg. I mean, so as I mentioned, it kind of starts in a localized source within localized area in the body. And then if your immune system cannot battle it within that localized source within our body, then it kind of spreads to the bloodstream, and then it kind of goes around the body and then perpetuates into sepsis.
Okay, and again, what's the cascade of issues that happen? And, when are the organs affected and how?
Yeah, so usually when you develop sepsis, it's characterized by hypotension or life-threatening falls in our blood pressure. And usually these patients are given drugs to actually maintain blood pressure in interstitial units, but they lose responsiveness to these drugs or vasopressors, as we call it, that are given to restore blood pressure back to normal. So it kind of leads to this perpetuating cycle of, low blood pressure that reduces perfusion of blood supply and oxygen delivery to vital organs, then leads to metabolic insufficiency, and then causes multi-organ failure, and often causes mortality. It's the leading cause of death in interstitial units around the world.
Why would it start with a drop in blood pressure? Like, how does sepsis happen? What is it? Is it certain bacteria that are getting into parts of the body that are wreaking havoc, or like what is it?
Yeah, so it kind of causes the systemic inflammatory response, or pathogen, your body kind of reacts to it with what we call a systemic inflammatory reaction, and then various chemicals, neurohumoral mediators are released, like nitric oxide, that can cause vasodilation of blood vessels that then drops our total peripheral resistance, which then causes blood pressure to fall. There is also edema, so like your blood vessels become leaky, so the volume kind of escapes from the intravascular components to the extravascular component. So yeah, it's kind of usually a combination of both. It's a leaky blood vessels as well as a increase in peripheral vasodilatation, or what we call vasoplegia, which leads to drops in blood pressure.
Okay, is there a bacterial component or a viral component?
Yeah, so basically, like if the origin of sepsis is bacterial, it's kind of like it's a systemic inflammatory response. Viral, it's the same. So in response to any pathogenic agent, kind of releases these PAMPs, so as we call it, pathogen-associated molecular patterns, and then kind of then damages the organs, and then releases damage-associated molecular patterns. So various mediators are released in response to these actions.
So does this typically occur in hospital settings, or does it happen at home to people, or at the scenes of accidents? Like, where does sepsis tend to occur and why?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, 70% of the cases usually are community acquired. So patients would become ill, like, either with a lung infection. I mean, you get like pneumonia, you'd stay at home, sometimes take some antibiotics, you're quite unwell. And then, usually, if your body can't resolve the infection, it kind of spreads across the body, and then kind of present to hospital by critically ill, diagnosed with sepsis. And in females, it's quite common to have a urinary tract infection that could then kind of lead to sepsis. Could start there and spread across the body. Hospitals, it's quite common after major surgical procedures like heart, major abdominal surgery or major heart surgery. And it's very prevalent in patients that are immunocompromised, that have pre-existing comorbidities like cancer, HIV, or diabetes, or hypertension. Any condition that really compromises your immune system, these type of patients are particularly more vulnerable.
How serious is it? How fast does it progress? And what are some medications?
Well, currently it's very serious, and the problem is currently there are really no targeted treatments for sepsis besides supportive treatments. I mean, right now, given fluids, maintain central blood volume, kind of mitigate against the leaky blood vessels. And if fluids cannot maintain blood pressure, they're given vasopressors, and then they're given antibiotics. So really, the treatments are really largely palliative or supportive in nature, where the clinicians hope that once the infection is resolved, that the underlying organ function will recover. So again, despite all these treatments, it's the leading cause of death in interstitial units around the world. So new effective treatments are urgently.
Well, how fast will someone go downhill to the point where they're irrecoverable, typically?
Really depends on person to person, Richard. I mean, it's really hard to kind of say that. So some patients, it really depends on how critically ill they are and how well they're responding to treatments. Patients that are responding fluids or vasopressors, they can kind of sustain those patients for a lot longer. But in some cases, patients become unresponsive to intensive care treatments. In that case, patients can go downhill within 24 hours and pretty much die within 24 hours or even less. So it's really depending on patient to patient, depending on how critically ill, what type of comorbidities they come in, or they had sepsis. So it's really variable.
Are you doing any research into this area, or is it all clinical? Like, what do you do about it? Where do you go from here?
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest problems is it's really difficult to understand what's going on within organs in these critically ill populations of patients, which really kind of provides the test for us to really develop clinically relevant animal models to replicate this disease. And this is that's been one of the biggest shortfalls in the field, is the lack of clinically relevant animal models to simulate these complex patient conditions. So that's what we have done at the Florey. We brought together clinicians and scientists, and we co-designed large animal modeling sheet that replicates this disease as best as possible, clinical environment. So what we have done is we have isolated a gram-negative bacterial strain from a patient with sepsis, and then we administer this directly via the bloodstream into sheep. And within 24 hours, they develop a phenotype that is very similar to what we see in patients with sepsis, where there are life-threatening falls in blood pressure, they have metabolic insufficiency, lung dysfunction, brain dysfunction. And we actually have quite unique techniques at the Florey to instrument multiple organs. So we can instrument the brain, the heart, kidneys, and the lungs. So we can actually take a systems physiological approach to really understand the onset and the mechanisms of disease in various organs. So, which is really the first step to really try to develop targeted diagnostics and therapeutics of this complex condition.
I guess you couldn't do an organoid model because you'd need a whole bunch of organs connected together and working in concert, right?
Now, it's really difficult, Richard, because it's a systemic condition. So isolating a particular organ is not really the way to go. I've been researching this condition for about 10 years of my career. And one of the biggest challenges that I faced when using this model is that with condition like sepsis that affects every organ in your body, you treat an organ, I'd say you're treating like the kidneys, there is a side effect that happens in another organ like the brain. So we really need to take a holistic view and take systems physiological approaches and really try and understand what's going on in every organ so we can develop a treatment that is universally beneficial, not just to one organ, particularly for a condition like sepsis.
Well, what was the bacteria that you guys analyzed and induced this?
So we're using a gram-negative bacterial strain called Escherichia coli, which is one of the most prevalent bacterial strains that are causing sepsis in patients. It accounts for about 8% of the bacterial infections that cause sepsis in the human population.
Oh, so it's a certain strain of E. coli that's where does it tend to occur? You isolated it from a person that had sepsis, or where does it come from?
That's absolutely right. So we isolated it from a patient that had sepsis.
I mean, just in general, though, where does is this strain already be in people and everywhere? It just gets changed by conditions, then becomes a problem, or is it a problem if it shows up at all in people?
No, it's a common strain, and we do testing, microbial testing, verify that it's still a relevant strain that's present in the population. So yeah, we've done that testing to verify that it's a common strain that's present, common strain that needs.
Okay, so what do you think is going to be the steps forward to combat sepsis? What ideas are coming?
2021, we had this breakthrough discovery at the Florey where we used a mega dose of the sodium salt or vitamin C, or sodium ascorbate as we call it. So it's pH balanced, unlike the normal native vitamin C that comes, which is ascorbic acid. So when we give this pH balanced formulation of sodium ascorbate directly via bloodstream, found that it led to profound beneficial effects in terms of reversing multi-organ dysfunction, the large animal model. So basically reversed cardiovascular dysfunction. It reduced the requirements for blood pressure maintaining drugs or vasoppressors. We can completely wean the animals off vasoppressors to maintain blood pressure. It reversed lung dysfunction. It reversed brain dysfunction. It reversed kidney dysfunction. It was quite a remarkable breakthrough in 2021, following which we treated a critically ill COVID-19 patient with sepsis on compassionate grounds. And this patient, again, had very similar responses to what we saw in the animal model, where the patient's blood pressure was able to be maintained by complete weaning of vasoppressors. Patient's kidney function recovered, and we could turn the patient off machine ventilator 12 days after treatment and discharge the patient from hospital 22 days after treatment. Following which, we got its approval to do a pilot double-blind randomized clinical trial at Austin Health, Professor Ronaldo Palomo, and we just finished patient recruitment last December in 2022. And the physiological signals we got from this clinical trial was very promising in terms of, significantly increasing kidney function, significant reductions in vasopressor requirements for blood pressure control, and also reduction in multi-organ dysfunction score, what called the sequential organ failure assessment score. This is currently being submitted to Critical Care, which is just a care journal.
Very good. Do you see any scientists in the field that are focusing on sepsis that are advancing certain treatments that have the potential to work? Or is it really more up to you, and this is a very niche thing that's being studied? Like, what does the lay of the land look like?
Well, I think there are various treatments that are coming, people are trying. It's a condition that's kind of like increasing in prevalence. That's a major global problem. It's an unmet need. But we do believe we are kind of leading the field with this particular treatment. And as I mentioned, as for most researchers, being at a treatment that is targeted towards one mechanism, one benefit that we are seeing with this treatment is it's got holistic effects towards improving multi-organ dysfunction. So we are very encouraged by the fact that it's not just reversing organ dysfunction within one organ bed. It actually kind of has multi-organ benefits towards the brain, the kidneys, the cardiovascular system, and the lungs. So we are very encouraged by those findings, and we're very excited to move this forward.
Where, I guess you just deal with patients locally, or are you working on clinical trials yourself, and recruiting to get certain things going, or is it more just clinical work that you're doing right now?
No, I'm more focused on the animal research. So I focus a lot of my efforts on trying to really understand the mechanisms of action on the physiological, biochemical, and immunological functional effects, and the effects of sodium ascorbate on those organ systems. But the clinical trials are run by our collaborators at various hospitals across mainland Australia.
Okay. Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out more about the stuff you're working on? Where can they go?
Yeah, so I think we were really fortunate. Towards the end of last year, I received a $5 million grant from the Medical Research Future Fund from the federal government of Australia. It is really a great group of scientists from leading medical research institutes across Australia, like Florey, the Doherty, Beehive, and the Mac and Monash University, really understand the physiological, biochemical, and immunological mechanisms. And this finding also enables us to now move this therapy forward, phase 1B and phase 2 clinical trials from Florida, New South Wales, South Australia, Northern Territory, Western Australia over the next 5 years. So this really kind of brings together this really great group of scientists and clinicians that are kind of united under one banner with common purpose. And yeah, I'm really excited to kind of like see where this goes in the next 5 years and see what kind of new discoveries that we can make that could really kind of push this treatment forward beyond Australia, clinical trials across the world.
Well, very good. Yugeesh, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
No, thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.